I guess. We'll see how all of this works. Unfortunately, once I have my program up on the screen, it really limits my ability to see chat or anything else. So I'm assuming everybody is getting this and my audio is coming through clearly. So maybe get some thumbs up from some folks. I can see a few screens out there if this is working for you. My name is Peter Kolb. I am the MSU Extension Forestry Specialist, and I've worked with fire for a long time. Normally we do this as a one-day workshop, but because of COVID, we can't do that. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. And we got about an hour and a half to cover all of these topics regarding burning piles, and so I'm going to move pretty quickly. And as Christina Obegard mentioned, we are recording this and we'll post it as a YouTube as well. At the end, I'll unmute everybody and there's a time for questions or anything like that. So with that, let's see where. Okay, I got some messages back that it looks good so far, so I will just proceed with that. Some of the information on here is also from a combined effort of working with Rick Turnbath, who was the Big Fork Fire Chief for many decades and has an awful lot of experience regarding fires. So here we go. So when talking about fires, of course, we always start with the fire triangle that for fire to burn, we need oxygen, we need fuel, and we need the right temperature. And the fuel for it to catch on fire is always pretty close to ambient air temperature, or kind of the average temperature of what it's been the last 12 hours or so. For something to burn or to start on fire, in this case woody debris, it has to reach a temperature of 570 degrees Fahrenheit or 300 degrees Celsius. And for comparison, water boils and vaporizes at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. And that's really important because water content is a very important factor of whether something will burn or not. And so when you're trying to heat a piece of wood up to the ignition point, basically you have to drive all of the water off first before the wood can reach a temperature where it will ignite. So basically you have to boil the water off as steam, because it absorbs all the heat and all the energy you're applying to that piece of wood, which is why wet things don't burn very easily. They have to dry out first. And fuels with a smaller mass, such as a blade of grass, heat up more quickly and ignite more quickly than something with a large amount of mass, such as a log, where a lot of heat gets conducted inward and you have a lot more biomass or mass to heat up before it reaches that flash point of 572 degrees Fahrenheit. So in a forested setting, we have all sorts of different kinds of fuels out there that can ignite. And of course, when we're doing any kind of prescribed burning, we only want our targeted fuels to burn and not our non-target fuels. So we have to consider the ignitability of the canopy, the shrub layer, the grasses and the forbs, the dead woody fuel, the fine fuels like mosses, lichens, and litter, and other ground fuels on the site. And they all burn a little differently, and they react differently to heat as well. So fire behavior is often predicted and modeled by the kind of fuels we have, the topography, and the climate. And the topography and the climate interact with each other quite a bit. So the types of fuels that we deal with are often referred to as 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, 1,000 hour fuels, and of course live fuels. Those hour figures do not mean how long they will burn, but rather how long it takes that fuel to lose 50% of its moisture at ambient air temperature. So how fast does it dry out? And so 1 hour fuels up to 1/4 inch in diameter, grasses, leaves, and needles. And that basically means at a given temperature, if you have a humidity change, it'll take them an hour to dry out. And of course, if you apply heat to them, that speeds it up a lot quicker. And so those are often sometimes called flash fuels. And those 1-hour fuels are typically what drive fire behavior in a wildfire type of event, because they heat up quickly, they ignite quickly, and so they are what dictates the rate of spread of a fire, and often the intensity, how fast things burn. And so think of 1-hour fuels like gasoline. They flash real quickly, but they don't burn a long time. 10-hour fuels are more like diesel fuel. It takes more to ignite them, but they give off more heat. And 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuels are a lot more almost like a nuclear bomb. It takes a lot to set them off, but once they go off, they release an enormous amount of energy. And live fuels fall into those categories based on how much moisture they have in them. So a tree stem would be like a 1,000-hour fuel, where a green tree needle might be more like a 1-hour to a 10-hour fuel. So for example, the real dangerous fuels we have out there are like cured grasses, and annual grasses are the worst. So this is a stand of cheatgrass, because annual grasses' whole life history is to grow quickly, reproduce, and then die. And so they stand there as cured fuels. And when we're prescribed burning, our biggest concern when we light a match is that the fire burns where it's not supposed to burn. And in Montana, for example, the liability laws are such that whoever ignites the fire is liable for the damage that the fire does. So if you do a prescribed burn and it burns onto your neighbor, you're potentially liable for all of the damages that occur there. And that's why prescribed burning is a difficult endeavor in Montana, because on a broad scale, say we wanted to burn this stand of trees, the understory, the risks associated with lighting that fire and that fire getting away from us are potentially very high, especially the financial risks. And that's why potentially pile burning, which I'm going to talk about today, is a very useful management tool, because we can configure and burn piles when there's snow on the ground, and these fine fuels are wet and too cold and won't burn, which really limits the risk and the liability that we have to deal with. So these are, when fires are modeled, fire behavior, wildfires, it's almost always the fine fuels that drive fire behavior and that we worry about. And so range and grass fires are a common phenomenon of fine fuel fires. These are the most dangerous kinds of fires. They move very fast. For example, the Boise Foothills fire was clocked at 80 miles an hour across the landscape. Whereas a forest fire, a really fast moving forest fire, is moving at maybe 5 miles an hour. And that's simply a factor of how fast those fuels heat up and how quickly they can ignite and allow spread to occur. And range fires have probably injured more people and livestock and done more property damage than any forest fire. So then we move into the 10-hour types of fuels. So this is a lot of what we deal with in forest settings, dried branches and twigs mixed in with 1-hour fuels. And so these also will carry a fire pretty easily. So these are concerns. Say if we want to light a pile on fire, how much of this stuff do we have? Because this is what's going to carry a fire to where it's not supposed to go. And if we have heavy accumulations, it can, like this pile in front of us, it can be very difficult to put out once it starts burning into that material. So what kind of fuels we have and the accumulations are really important. So, and the higher the accumulations, we can also lead to severe soil heating, which makes recovery after the fire much more difficult and slower. So then we move into the larger fuels, the 100-hour, 1,000-hour fuels, such as logs like this. Large diameter fuels like this are very difficult to ignite. So when wildfires are being modeled, these kind of fuels rarely play into the modeling unless they're extremely dry. And since it takes them so long to dry out, these kind of fuels become a factor in fire behavior only after a long, hot summer with a lot of drought. So like this last summer in Montana, where we had a wet spring, a wet early summer, And then it got hot and dry, and we had forest fires in the later part of the summer. These fuels really did not burn very much. So you go on the Bridger Foothills fire that jumped to 7,000 acres in a matter of hours. That was because it burned across a lot of grasses and dried forested areas, and it was driven by wind. And even in that fire afterwards, where there were heavy fuel loadings of this kind of material, these materials contributed very little to the fire. The outsides charcoaled, but they were not consumed. Now that's very different in a very long, prolonged dry summer. When these fuels dry out, then they become very dangerous because they do ignite. And when they do burn, they contribute enormous amount of energy to the existing fire behavior, which can lead to extreme winds and fire behavior. When we're burning piles, one of the concerns is if we're burning in this kind of material and these catch on fire, they can smolder for a long time. And so it's kind of hard to contain a fire that is burning in these kind of heavy fuels. But usually we don't worry about them too much because they're not flash fuels. They don't allow fire to spread very quickly. So to give you an idea how fire moves, here's a series of pictures I took during a wildfire. I was on the fire line, and the fire was largely contained, but as the day warmed up, all of a sudden the smoldering duff ignited some fine fuels. So you can see the flames starting to flare up in some dried grasses and shrubs there behind that ponderosa pine tree. And in a matter of minutes, it got into a clump of sapling trees, and they had been preheated by the smoldering fire underneath them. The water had been driven out of the needles, and that fire then climbed into those sapling trees. And from there, it then climbed into some taller trees. And within a matter of 5 minutes, it went from a surface fire to torching out the canopy of this tree. Now, this was an isolated tree. But the danger is once a fire gets into a canopy, it can ignite other canopies, and such tall flaming fires will throw embers and sparks that can go across fire lines. They can travel great distances. And in some situations, if the wind is really blowing, these embers can travel a mile and start a fire at another location. And such spot fires is often how fires spread across a landscape. So when we're burning piles, we often get very high flame lengths off those piles. We want to make certain that embers that fly off those piles can't land in something like a dried field of grass that can ignite that grass and let the fire escape. So one of the things that we always look at, and I mean, before I burn, I always look at the fine fuels around the area, and I'll actually take a match and try and light them. And if I throw a burning match into that material and it just goes out, then I know that a burning ember that lands that material isn't going to start a fire. Whereas if I light a match and I put it in that material and it starts to ignite that cured grass, I'll stop it out real quick and I won't ignite at that point in time because the risk of burning embers from that pile landing in something and starting something else on fire are too great. And I'll go into that in greater detail. So, in forests, we look at not only the amount of fuel, but the distribution. The more aerially suspended, vertically suspended these fine fuels are, the greater the risk of that fire getting too big and jumping out of control. So in this case, with these fuel ladders here, in these trees and hanging needles, I would not want to have a pile burning close to this material when this stuff is flammable. Now, when it's wet, I'm not worried about it at all. And so the season and the weather is a very, very important part of when I ignite and when we burn piles. So just to, again, give you an illustration, we can kind of segregate fire into surface fires, fire ladders, and torching in trees. And we certainly don't want to have trees torch on us. For one, it kills the tree. But the second is once a tree torches, it's going to throw embers and it can ignite other crowns. And this is when things get really dangerous for us. So, just as a perspective on a landscape basis, if we look at this landscape and we assess the fuel hazard and we look at all this, so I kind of drew in some lines here to zone out different forest conditions where this is old decadent lodgepole pine with a lot of dead trees in it. In the foreground is mature Douglas fir, and sort of in the middle is an old harvest unit with young lodgepole pine. So we all instinctively might look at this and go, oh, that old lodgepole pine stand is the most dangerous setting because it has all this dead fuel and all this dead material in there. But let's look at it a little bit more closely. So the lodgepole pine forest, when you get into it, looks like this. A lot of dead standing trees, a lot of large diameter dead material, but not a lot of fine fuels. Okay, so for a fire to burn in this, all of this dead, large woody debris has to be very dry. When it's wet, or in the spring when this stuff is damp, these forests don't burn very well. Even though there's a lot of fuel, it's not fine fuel. Alternatively, if it's the end of August and these have been drying all summer long, now they ignite very easily, and when they do burn, they give off an enormous amount of heat. So these are really conditional forest fire hazard settings where under extreme weather conditions, like the end of August of this year, or in California this year, these can support enormous fires that are unstoppable because of the fuel loading. But in cool, wet conditions, these forests are almost like asbestos. They don't burn really well. And that's where we often get in these debates saying, oh, well, these old, dead, decadent forests don't support a crown fire. Well, they don't support a crown fire because they don't have the fine fuels in the crown anymore. Most of the trees are dead. There's no fine fuels there. And so it's trying to light individual telephone poles, which doesn't work really well. Now, juxtaposed to that, we get into the Douglas fir forest. When we look at it, and we tend to think, it's pretty healthy. There's low fuel loading in the base of this forest. So really, there's also not a lot of fuel there as we traditionally think. But if we look at the crowns, we see there's a lot of fine material up in the top of that canopy, and the canopies are all touching. So when these trees are drought stressed, and all that fine fuel in there, and we get a fire into the crowns of these trees, it becomes a raging, unstoppable fire. So this is actually a higher fire danger under moderate conditions than the dead lodgepole pine stand. But of course, in an extreme drought, they're both equally dangerous. But this forest, if you get a crown fire, will support an active crown fire, whereas the dead lodgepole pine will support a severe surface fire. They're both really bad. They both are very hard to contain, but there's just these differences in fire behavior that you should be aware of. And again, just you can compare the crown density and the fine fuels in the crowns of these trees. We can see certainly the Douglas fir forest has much more fine fuel up in the canopy than the lodgepole pine forest does. Now, in the summer, the most dangerous fires are active crown fires. So once fires get in the crowns and we have the crown density and the needle fuel moisture content is low enough to support easy combustion and ignition, then you get these crown fires moving across a landscape, and they're giving off so much energy you can't stop them. And this is, of course, what everybody thinks of as what they're worried about. Now, when we're burning piles at the right time of year, so in the fall, the risk of a crown fire is usually almost non-existent, because it's if we're burning properly, it's cooler temperature, it's after rain, the trees are well hydrated, and crown fires are not likely. What we're more worried about is these bigger fuels. Once they dry out, it takes them a while to get wet again. So these can burn well into the fall until they absorb enough moisture where they're not flammable anymore. And this all plays into how dangerous it is to burn piles. And we also want to look at the vertical distribution. So if all the logs are laying on the ground, it's not as dangerous as if logs are suspended like this, because they burn a lot hotter, they dry out a lot quicker, and they don't get wet as quickly. And again, just to reiterate, so this is a dense Douglas fir stand with not very much fuel in the base, but a dense canopy. So if we have a surface fuel, and so say it's raining outside or it's late in the fall, I would have no problems burning piles inside a stand like this, because the trees are hydrated, the canopy is wet, and it's not going to ignite very easily. It's probably not going to ignite at all. I'm more worried about surface fuels and a fire going from my pile into the surface into other areas. Now, the other thing to think about is younger trees and regeneration. A lot of you are doing thinning of these kinds of stands. And it's real interesting, these younger forests, and we get into them, it appears there's a lot of fuel there, but actually there's not. It's all live fuel. And there's this real interesting phenomenon that when we examine some of these massive fires across the landscape, these up to 30-year-old clear cuts don't burn. They don't carry a fire, even though there's a raging fire all around them, because the younger, smaller canopy doesn't use water as fast. It allows a deep snowpack. These trees stay hydrated. So the difference between the mature forest around them and the smaller, younger trees is the younger trees just have a lot higher water content in their needles, and it's much harder to ignite them. And so, you know, burning piles, if we're doing thinnings in these younger stands, really isn't as dangerous as it might seem to be if we do it the right time of year. Whereas the bigger trees are a lot drier and tend to be a little bit more dangerous, and especially if there's surface fuels connected with it. So just another example, a different scenario, but I have hundreds of case studies and examples of where clear cuts simply don't burn under these fire conditions, simply because the live fuel moisture is high, that it takes too much energy to drive that moisture out of the needles for these little trees to catch on fire. And like I said, on average, I would say these clear cuts are pretty resilient, and younger trees are pretty resilient to about 30 years of age. So, of course, this is the scenario that we don't want to be burning in with an open fire. And usually when we're creating piles, these are the situations we want to resolve, where we have both horizontal and vertical fuel continuity. But live fuels can be the same. Again, if they're hydrated, so in the spring, this is not a very flammable stand. But towards the end of summer, when the live fuel moisture has dropped down to maybe 50% or half of what it is in the spring, then suddenly all the pitches and the terpenes and the needles are very flammable, and there's not a lot of water to drive out of them, and they're extremely flammable. So time of year makes a big difference. And likewise, forest density. So here's a forest that is really fire resilient from a surface fire perspective. But if the fire gets in the crowns of these trees and we have a wind driving it, this forest will burn in a heartbeat under drought conditions. Again, if the live fuel moistures are low. And so thinning those is one way to alleviate some of the risk of a crown fire spreading through them. Of course, when we thin trees out, we create light and resources on the soil surface that allows for regeneration. So there is no perfect solution that lasts a long time. When we want to resolve the dangers and risks from a crown fire, then we're setting up the stage for a surface fire because we're promoting a lot of regeneration. So forest management is just a continual process. All right, so getting to the actual topic here of how do we go about burning piles in a safe, productive, and sound manner. So when we look at fires and energy exchange, oxygen is drawn into the fire. And what we're seeing is a chemical oxidation process where the organic material is combining with that oxygen and giving off a lot of heat in the process. And as the cooler is drawn in the base, the hot air rises to the top. And so this is what we call convection, where the hot air goes up and heats everything in its path. So now remember, for fire to spread, fuel has to preheat to 550 degrees about before it ignites. And so we have to be cognizant of where the heating is going. So which direction is the blowtorch pointing in essence? So convection is one way that heat is transferred to surrounding vegetation. And so when there's no wind, and so this is a pile I burned on my property in the back, you can see I'm not worried about surrounding trees because all the heat is going up between the canopies. And as long as my trees are, 10 to 15 feet away from the fire, and the wind does not blow this flame into those trees, they're pretty safe. Now, the other way that heat is transferred is what's called radiation. Okay, radiation is anything that's warmer than absolute zero, which is minus 270 degrees centigrade, radiates energy. The hotter it is, the more energy it radiates. And so this is the effect when you stand next to a wood stove. The heat you feel from it is radiation. Okay, so radiation can also preheat fuels, and that's why if you stand too close to the fire, you're going to get burned by radiant heat. If you stand downwind from a fire, you're going to get burned from convective heat. And in a wind situation, you have both radiation and convection. Now, radiation extinguishes pretty quickly. For every foot of horizontal airspace it has to move through, radiation loses half of its energy. And so, again, there is a heating zone, a radiation zone around a fire, and if you burn a pile, you'll know exactly where that radiation zone is. It's where your clothes starts to melt and where you start to feel uncomfortable. So, and what we worry about and why we watch the weather very carefully is wind is the big unknown factor in burning piles. So this was actually a prescribed burn where a front came in and wind gusts started blowing the flames sideways, so that we had, in the direction of the wind, or in the direction the wind was blowing into, we not only had radiation heat exchange, we also had convection. And that's it when it gets really dangerous. And that's how wind can cause a fire to get out of control or travel across the landscape, because you have both radiation and convection preheating the fuels to the flash or ignition point. So the thing we got to consider, and I already mentioned that, is when we're burning piles, there will be embers coming off those fires. So this is a pile I burned at night, and you can see all the embers coming off of it. I wasn't worried in the least, because as I'll show you later on, as the temperature cools, the humidity goes up. So as the air gets wet, it imparts that moisture on the fine fuels. That's why if you go for a walk in the evening, your feet will get wet, or in the morning, the lawn is wet, whereas midday, it's dry. So often burning piles is safest to do in the afternoon or evening when the humidity goes up and all your fine fuels get wet, and there is no risk of those catching fire and moving your fire. Unfortunately, with air quality standards, most air districts want you to burn between 10 and 4. So 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, which is the hottest and driest part of the day, and the day most conducive for your fine fuels to dry out and fire to spread. Now, there are exceptions for burning woody debris, okay? So, you know, that you can, obviously, when you're burning slash piles, they're not gonna be out by 4 in the afternoon. And so most air districts will understand that, but they usually want you to ignite earlier in the day to avoid smoke accumulations at night. All right, so how many piles, how are they constructed, and how big is often an issue. As an example, in scale, one 16-inch diameter ponderosa pine will create a debris pile about 8 feet diameter and 6 feet tall if you remove the stem. Imagine you're removing a dozen trees. You can see about how much debris you're going to generate and how many potential piles you may generate. And you can either put them all in one huge pile, or you can create, say I'm removing 6 trees, 6 intermediate sized piles. That's always a question what to do. How you create a pile is really important, because remember, this woody debris needs oxygen to burn. So it should be well aerated. And so when you're burning large debris and fine debris, I really like to do a teepee type of approach. You can crisscross it or a teepee approach. And the larger fuels, if I have to manhandle them in place, I actually like to lean them against the outside, place them down in the center, because when this pile burns, the fines are going to burn first. They're going to put an ash layer over the heavy fuels, and those heavy fuels, larger fuels, aren't going to get enough oxygen to burn cleanly, and they're going to smolder for a long time. Whereas if the large fuels are on the outside, kind of leaned in on the pile, the fine fuels will ignite them, and the large fuels have enough oxygen so they can burn more cleanly, and they'll contribute more heat to the pile, which will cause the pile to burn more efficiently as well. You know, in a lot of treatments, we're using heavy equipment. Heavy equipment requires the right kind of equipment and a skilled operator, and I'll show you why. So here's a small dozer with a brush blade on the front. The whole idea is that when it's pushing debris into piles to burn, because this was a site where it was too risky to do a broadcast burn on, so we use this equipment to create multiple small piles, but we did not want to push any soil into these piles. Okay, mineral soil doesn't burn, and it'll do the same thing that heavy or wet debris. It'll deprive the woody debris of oxygen, will result in a smoldering fire. Plus, that top organic layer is very valuable. That's where all the nutrients are. That's where the water holding capacity for the site is. If you burn it, it will lose that valuable quality. It'll lose all the organics out of it, and you'll actually chemically convert that soil in some cases. So machine-created piles tend to be denser and larger because they're being pushed with a lot of force and a lot of heavy equipment. On average, they need at least one hot summer month to dry out to burn adequately. Again, the more moisture you have in the fuels, the more heat it's going to be going to require to drive the moisture out, the slower it's going to burn, the more smoldering, the more heat you're going to produce, the longer the fire is going to burn, and the more longer you have to tend it, and the more you're going to have to repile as it burns to keep it burning. So typically debris generated in winter or spring is best left over the summer to dry out and then burned in the fall. Now, in some cases, if there's a risk of Ips pine eye beetle, pine engraver breeding in these piles, the solution is to burn them in the spring or create piles that are large enough that the beetles will infest the outside of the pile, and when they hatch out at the end of the beginning of July, they'll just dive in deeper in the pile rather than hitting live trees around them. So pine engraver is usually the only beetle we have to worry about in slash piles like this. So winter log piles in the spring, they're very wet. Again, often they've been piled by machinery, so they're very compact, and these suckers will smolder for a month. And so that's not only really bad for the air quality, but say you ignite them in May, beginning of May, they're still smoldering the end of May, and weather could have changed very hot and dry, and now you have a danger that this fire is going to escape into fine fuels around them. So here's an example of a machine-generated pile that's just way too compacted. It will burn very poorly. It'll generate a lot of smoke. It'll impart a lot of heat into the soil because the heat can't escape out of it. So this is best to get a remedial treatment, get in there with a piece of machinery, and you can either roll these piles, so just put the blade and push them over, that aerates them, or you can take an excavator and fluff them a little bit to get more air into them. And here's the concern we have with compacted piles is they'll burn, but they will belch really acrid smoke for long periods of time. And this is what gets us all into trouble because especially in the fall, when we have cold temperatures coming in, these valleys are all subject to inversions. And that's actually why air quality districts prefer spring burning over fall burning, because in the fall we get inversions and the smoke can fill those valley bottoms and make the air quality really, really miserable. Whereas in the spring, we're warming up, and so we tend to have a little bit more wind and the smoke disperses a little bit more. Though the problem is when we produce a lot more smoke because they're wet. So it's kind of a conflicting situation that we run into. Alternatively, a well-stacked pile that's well aerated will burn like this, and as you can see, there's almost no smoke coming off of it. So, and the only difference is how the pile was created, whether it's well aerated and stacked loosely or whether it's compacted. And of course, if we go back to this, often logging, there's a lot of debris generated. There's a limited area to create a pile. So the solution is to compact that pile as much as possible because then I can get more stuff into it. The problem is now you're creating a pile that doesn't burn real well. So, and then the real solution is just to create more piles that are smaller, that are the right configuration. So tools for ignition, diesel fuel is a real good igniter. Never use gasoline because gasoline, as soon as you put it on something, it starts to vaporize. And so you put some gas on a slash pile and then you put your container away and you find your matches, your lighter. That whole time the gas is starting to vaporize. And by the time you ignite it, you have just created an air gas bomb, and that gas will just go whoosh. In some cases, it'll blow the pile apart. In most cases, it'll burn your eyebrows off, and then it's out, and it doesn't impart enough heat to start the pile on fire. So number one or number two diesel, which is what is put in the drip torch. Usually in a drip torch, it's a mixture of 80% diesel, 20% gasoline, because diesel really doesn't want to ignite easily. It just doesn't burn that easily. So coming out of a drip torch like this, which is simply a device, the container is full of liquid, flammable liquid. The curl in the spout is to prevent gas and fire going back into the container. And you just tip it and the diesel mixture drips out over the burning wick onto your fuel, and that's how you ignite it. The other alternative is a propane torch. This kind of torch, the propane canister is the classic canister you use for your grill. The torch you can buy at for $30 at Harbor Freight Tools. It's relatively inexpensive. A drip torch, you're looking at upwards of $200 for one. Okay, this is actually my preferred tool for starting piles on fire, because I can use a valve to determine how much gas is coming out of it, so how big of a flamethrower it is. I can stick the end in the pile and I can walk away from it and let it torch that pile for 10, 15, 20, even 30 minutes, providing enough heat to get a good fire going. Whereas a drip torch, I'll pour some burning fuel on it, it'll start things burning, then the fuel will burn out, and if the pile is slightly wet, it won't heat it up enough to really get it going, and I'll have to do it over and over and over again. Whereas this, I can just get enough heat on there till the pile really starts to burn. You can put it on a backpack, and you can go from pile to pile with it as well. Again, relatively inexpensive, easy to use. So that's actually the tool that I use the most of in burning piles. When you're burning piles, also, it's important to wear the right kind of clothes. Cotton or wool, no synthetics. Anything synthetic will melt. And as you'll find out when you're burning piles, especially if you're throwing them together to get to avoid ending up with a ring of debris, you'll get a lot of radiation onto you. And you'll feel it on your face, but by the time it's too hot on your face, your pants legs are ready to the point where synthetics will melt. So cotton or wool doesn't burn at all. Wool is just fabulous because it might smolder a little bit, but it won't burn. Leather boots with grippy soles. You don't want to slip and fall into a fire once it's burning, of course. Leather also doesn't burn. A lot of boots these days are synthetic. They will melt. Safety glasses are really good because these branches will pop and explode when they get heated and the steam blows them apart. And I like a hard hat or a cotton or wool ball cap. I prefer a wool ball cap because, again, when I'm throwing these piles together, the bones on the outside of the fire, that brim protects my face. I just put my head down a little bit and it keeps the radiation off of my face. Cotton burns a little more easily, and burning embers will come out of these fires as well. If you're not wearing a hat, they'll land on your head and they will burn you. And so, something that's non-flammable on your head is very helpful. So mechanisms of burning, once we light the fire, and this is probably one of the most dangerous situations to light a fire in. It's being done in a safe setting, but it's dangerous because you have dry cured grass around it, okay, which catches and carries a fire and will escape from you faster than any other kind of fuel that's out there. So this fire was ignited after a good rain, and all these fine fuels are really wet. And again, a trick that I use is I'll find a little clump of grass right next to my pile. I'll light a farmer's match and I'll drop it into that clump of grass. If the match burns and then goes out and doesn't ignite the grass, I know I'm safe to burn the pile. Because if embers come out of this and it lands in the grass, it's not going to go anywhere. On the other hand, if that tuff immediately explodes into flame, I under no circumstances want to light that pile on fire, because any embers is going to start the grass field on fire. And once that grass field starts going, it's going to be over in the neighbors in a heartbeat. Now, as this pile burns, you're going to get radiant heat from the pile that dries surrounding fuels. You're going to get those fuels those dry fuels then starting to burn. So you'll see the fire creep out of this pile, which is okay. So a good tool to have is a shovel. Normally, I and others will let the fire burn out in the grass to a certain safe zone where I can be, and then I'll just snuff it out with the shovel blade. I'll just stomp on it with the shovel blade and put it out. Now I have a fuel-free zone around the fire as well. The other, of course, important part is I've got a good convection column, so the smoke is going up, it's going away. I don't have a lot of wind going on in this case, so the risk of this fire escaping is very minimal. So again, when we're burning, what are some things to consider? Well, if we look at the height of the slash pile I'm burning, usually flames that you can expect out of a pile will be 3 times as high as the fuel you have. Okay, so if you're worried about an overstory canopy or tree cover, think about how big a pile you're going to make if you need to burn it inside those trees. Okay, so the flame off of any fuel will often go 3 times as high as that fuel is airily suspended. But there's also still superheated gases, so 4 to 5 times as high as the pile is the ignition zone within that pile. Okay, and I'll give you an example that even under these kinds of conditions, say we're burning in a forest, if you have dry, dead, fine fuels, like in this subalpine fir, and here's Rick Trembath demonstrating what can happen. He's just taken a cigarette lighter and lighting some branches on the subalpine fir when, you know, we've had a good snowfall. It's pretty safe to burn outside, but because those fuels underneath that tree are dry, they will ignite. So you need to identify the fuels around the piles you're going to burn. And so where all the green trees are not going to catch fire no matter what you do. I mean, you can build a burn pile right under them and you might scorch the needles, but they won't catch on fire. Trees that accumulate a lot of woody material inside of them, like subalpine fir or spruce, remain flammable. So always, when you make piles, survey what fine fuels are around them that can ignite. So another tactic that I use, it's pretty simple. I usually burn a lot of small piles, and by small, I say the size of a VW Beetle or smaller. Okay, that's a small pile. Again, I'm getting a pretty good flame, but you know, dragging this woody debris a long distance to a huge opening is a lot of work. It's time consuming. So I create a lot of small piles in my forest when I'm thinning or cleaning up. But I'm sometimes a little bit worried, not about these trees catching fire. I don't have a spruce or subalpine fir there with the dead fuels, but I do have trees that I can damage the crowns from the heat. I don't want to scorch the crowns of surrounding trees. So I have some old corrugated roofing panels that are 3 to 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. And once the fire is burning well, I put those on top, and you can see what it does to the convection column. It reflects the heat back into the pile and actually gets a better burn going in the pile because there's more heat going back in the pile, and it prevents the fire from creating that huge convection column that will scorch the tops of my trees. And I can use that, position that on the pile. So if I have a tree nearby that's a little closer than I want it to be, I'll put that corrugated metal on that side, not against the tree, but that side of the fire. And that way the radiant heat from that pile will not affect the tree as much. So another example, here's a bigger pile, some pretty good flames on there, a simple piece of old sheet metal on top of it, and it has completely changed the dynamics, the thermodynamics of that fire, and the danger of that fire scorching the crowns of the nearby trees. And again, where I put that piece of metal will determine where the heat and flames go. So it's not, burning piles is not just lighting the pile and walking away. You always want to monitor them, but the centers will burn out of these piles and the outside will be left. So, you know, I might be burning 10 piles at one time, and once they're burning well, I will circulate from pile to pile, and when they get to this point, I'll throw the outside into the center and create another fire going there, and then I will end up with a well-consumed pile of debris. If I just light it and I walk away, then I'll have that bone pile on the outside of the fire, so remnant woody debris, and which remains as a hazard or something that I might not want. And again, here's one of the benefits of small piles is they're easy to manage, but the residual effect is minimal. So there isn't a lot of heating of the soil. You end up with a thin ash layer and some charcoal left on the site. So this is the summer after I burn that pile. And these scarification sites are places where trees that need scarification can germinate in, whether larch or ponderosa pine. So we're normally, I'll go back here, on this site, I'd have difficulty getting ponderosa pine to regenerate, just Douglas fir that regenerates better in the organic layer. I need that mineral soil for ponderosa pine or larch. And so these burn piles are strategically placed where I can recruit larch and ponderosa pine as seedlings. And the interesting thing is that charcoal ring on the outside of that burn spot is the best place for recruiting seedlings, where that ash layer in the center actually is a little on the alkaline side, and it dries out very easily, it's not good for tree seedlings to grow in. They don't like those thick ash layers, but they do like the charcoal. So at the end of the program, I'll spend a little time on rehabbing larger burn piles. So burn piles can be used as a secondary benefit, and that is you can strategically locate them to get regeneration of trees that you're having a hard time getting regeneration from because of the existing competing vegetation, or because those tree species need a good mineral seedbed to grow in. So here's just another example. This is a larger burn pile in a forested setting, and you can see those little green tufts in there, a close-up. So those are 1-year larch, and these burn pile, the ash is very high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for about 2 years after the fire. So a larch, which is requires a lot of nutrients as a seedling, really likes these burn piles. That's what it's adapted to do. And you can get 2-3 feet of height growth off a larch tree within 2-3 years on these burn piles. And it's the only place where you'll get larch regeneration in this kind of a forested setting. So what about bigger piles? So big pile burning, they put out a lot more heat. Generally, we try to wait until there's some snow on the ground before we burn them. Snow creates a layer on top of the tree, on top of these piles. It can be difficult to ignite because as the fire gets going and it melts the snow, the water then puts the fire back out again. So I always like to put about at least a 6x6 sheet of tarp or water impervious layer on top of a strategic spot on this. And then before I light it, I'll remove the tarp. And by doing so, I've created a chimney in the pile where there's no snow on top. And that's where I'll try and ignite it first. In that, you only have to use tarp a small spot. You don't have to tarp the whole thing. The whole trick is to get the pile burning in the first place. So ignition, again, usually produces a fair amount of smoke because you don't have high temperatures. You're getting a lot of incomplete combustion. In the meantime, snow, and you have wet fuel, so all the moisture needs to be drawn off. So this pile was actually strategically lit. Let me go back. So you can see that around the backside of this pile are some live trees, and they're kind of close to the pile. And so when this whole pile is burning, it's going to produce enough radiation that could potentially scorch those trees. So this pile was strategically lit on the side opposite of those trees, and I'll show you why. Because once it ignites, you're getting a better combustion, less smoke, good flames, good heat, a lot of heat coming off of this. But if I walk around to the backside between the pile and the trees, that's what I have. By not lighting that side, I've created an organic barrier. So those trees are not being exposed to the radiation from that big pile when it's burning. And by the time that pile actually burns that barrier off, most of the debris will have been burned. And so I'm not going to get the radiation loading on those trees. And so by the next morning, here's what I'm left with. Again, just like a small fire, I've got all of the unburned material on the outside. Just wasn't enough heat to catch it on fire. So now you just work around that pile and throw the unburned debris into hot spots where there's piles of glowing embers. And then those will also consume, and all you're left with is an ash pile, which is the purpose behind all of this. Now, as an example, these were machine piles. This was a pile that was extremely compacted. I mean, they just tried to cram as much as possible into this pile. So it was very, very dense. And because it was very dense, it didn't dry out real well. And even after it was lit, there wasn't enough oxygen getting into all that fuel in there. So it was a smoldering combustion. So a lot of dry distillation, and that smoke coming out of there is very acrid. A lot of volatile organics in there, stuff you don't want to breathe. A lot of formaldehyde and things like that in there. And this was just a burn class where we were burning different piles. But, you know, this pile was a real challenge. We knew it was going to be. We knew it would burn, but of course, we didn't want to generate a lot of smoke because this is going to fill the whole countryside with acrid smoke. 12 hours later, it's still generating a lot of smoke. It is burning, but because it's so compacted, the center of the pile is not burning well. The next morning, this is what the pile looked like. And that center cone is actually 8 feet tall. And when you look into it, it's this big smoldering ember. You're creating a lot of charcoal in there. And I get a lot of questions. How long will these fires burn? Well, if properly constructed, the fire will burn down within 12 hours. The coal bed might stay active for 2-3 days. This pile, however, because it was so compacted and it created such an enormous charcoal bed, actually burned for an additional 5 months. So come May, it was still smoldering, which is unbelievable. I worked with this landowner and I kept tabs with him and I kept asking him, well, how's that pile doing? Still smoldering. And in May, it was still smoldering. And now it's a danger because in May, things are drying out. And so a smoldering pile like this, it comes spring, all of a sudden the wind can blow the ashes off the top, can blow embers out, and boom, this thing can be off and running. But this is really extreme, and this is also why you don't want to have these big compacted piles. That opposed, here's another pile. It wasn't as big, but it was nice, loose pile. Within 12 hours, this is what was left. So very little cleanup. Again, we just threw the outside together. Pretty easy to burn. Very little smoke coming off of it. So my bias and my preference tends to go to creating lots of small piles rather than one huge pile. It's less labor intensive if I'm piling by hand or less equipment traffic. Now that depends on the logging system you're using. If you're using whole tree skidding, they're going to delimb at a landing and you're going to end up with a giant pile. That's just the logistics of the type of logging you use. If you use cut to length, then you're going to get more distributed debris. You can create lots of small piles. If you tarp them, or even if you don't, these piles can be burned when there's snow on the ground. When there's snow on the ground, there is zero probability of these piles getting away from you. And because the trees are cold and there's snow in the trees, there is much less risk of your fires creating any kind of damage to surrounding trees, any kind of scorch or heat loading on those stems. And, it's kind of fun. So, same site, sometimes I'll be out there till midnight or 1 in the morning. It's kind of magical. Though in cases you have to be careful. This particular site, when I got there to light the piles, had big grizzly bear tracks going between the piles. So there was a big bear around, and when I was out there at night, of course, I'm blinded by these different fires, and as I was walking from one pile to another, all of a sudden I heard this running coming at me, and my heart stopped, and it was a couple of white-tailed deer that were running through there. But, anyways, so you got to be conscious of what's around you. So a little bit of theory on burning. So the important thing about fire and burning is humidity. What is the relative humidity out there of the air? And as the air warms, its capacity to hold water increases, so the humidity goes down. So, and the humidity is basically how much water is in the air divided by how much water the air can hold. Hot air can absorb a lot more water. Cold air does not absorb water. So when temperatures cool down, the water drops out of the air, and that's the dew, that's the high humidity. That's when the fine fuels get wet, and the risk of your fire escaping from you is very minimal or non-existent. And that's why starting a fire in the morning, now you're approaching the time when the humidity drops the most and your risk of escape is the highest. So I typically like to start my fires in the afternoon after the hottest, driest time, unless I'm burning in snow, when I really am going to rely on that higher temperature to help my fire go during the day. But if I'm at all worried about surrounding vegetation, I will not light in the morning. I'll only light in the late afternoon when I know the temperature is going to drop and the humidity is going to get higher. So fall burn versus spring burn, again, there's pros and cons to all of that. In the fall, the soil organic matter is dry, it's going to burn. But your fuel, if it's had time to dry out, is very dry and you'll get a clean burn. And you have winter that's going to put the fire out eventually. Spring burn is a lot riskier. It's a lot harder because your fuels, especially the big fuels, are wet. And so your piles will smolder and smolder and smolder and produce a lot of smoke. And they'll persist for a while. And so now you're lighting maybe when the conditions are right, but then the climate, the temperature is warming. And so you're going to have a fire that might be burning when the conditions change to a situation where you don't want to be burning. So I'm not a big fan of spring burning. I do it, but I always do it when I know there's a cool or wet front coming, so I know that my fire isn't going to be influenced by a warm, dry front that comes in. So, you know, your laws that dictate burning when your season is. So, you know, these are readily available everywhere. There's guidelines for all of that. I'm not going to bore you with reading all this. There are airshed impact zones. So this is the one for Kalispell. Missoula has one. Almost every municipality has an air quality zone. Be very cognizant of which zone you're in, because when you can burn will depend on when you have good air dispersal and when the air quality department will allow you to burn. So for example, a couple of days ago, we had perfect weather for burning, no wind or anything like that, but burn permits, you weren't allowed to burn because without any air movement, there was a danger of smoke from piles accumulating in the valley bottoms and not being dispersed. So you got to make sure you know what your smoke restrictions are, and smoke management will restrict you more than anything else will. For example, these are common to Montana, western Montana, that December 1 to February 29th, there's no burning allowed just because of the risk of inversions. Burning season starts March 1st. For forestry debris, you can burn actually to November 30th. Now that's different than recreational burning or debris burning. Say you're burning grasses and things like that. Your season usually ends in October, whereas forest debris burning will go a month longer. So when you're filling out your permit, make sure that you're checking the right boxes, that it is a forestry activity if you're burning slash piles, and not just recreational burning or convenience burning. So again, you really have to look what your weather is going to do. You don't want to start fires when a warm front is moving or in a really windy front is moving in. I prefer to start burning when a cold front or a rain front is coming in. So that way I know once my piles are burning, then eventually rain or snow will put them out versus the opposite. So this is a slide from Rick Trimbath that really, there's 10 rules, fire orders. The first deal with fire behavior. 1, keep informed on fire weather conditions and forecasts. So dry, windy weather. You want to avoid starting a fire when dry, windy weather is coming in. Second, know what your fire is doing at all times. So once you light, you're committed, okay? You're committed till it's a bed of coals. And even past then, if you have wind coming into it. If you can't be out there, find someone that you can tag team with that can be out there keeping an eye on things. And 3, base all your actions on current and expected fire behavior. So watch what your fire is doing. I mean, there are times when I've had a water source on there, and when things got a little dicey for me, I put it out. I rarely have to do that. The one slide I showed you of the horizontal fire, where the wind front came in, that was actually a prescribed burn. The weather forecast said a front was coming in. I actually warned the burn boss, hey, you better not light this because we got a front coming in. The burn boss said, no, I got this. They lit it. And we almost lost that sucker because when that front hit, that wind was really howling and blowing those embers all over the place. So the final part of this is pile rehab needed. So you burn. You end up with this big burn pile. So this one was lit and walked away from, so you have all this debris around the outside. You have a thick ash layer out there. This is something I've studied for a long time, and I can guarantee you that if you do nothing with this pile, you walk away and you come back 10 years from now, nothing will have changed, okay? Thistles, hound's tongue, mullein, and sometimes snowberry is the only thing that will grow in these burn piles. Tree seedlings will die in it. It's very alkaline. This ash is very alkaline. The soil has often been baked underneath, which makes it hard for it to absorb water. So really, these piles need to be treated if you want them to quickly rehab. So here's an example. I did a study several years ago where I tried different treatments. So here's what was left afterwards. It was a big pile. I couldn't stay there the whole time. So it took me about 15 minutes to pile the bones together because I'll eventually burn this pile again. And then what I want to do is disperse that ash layer. That ash is white or orange. It's very fluffy, and I can take a shovel or a piece of equipment and just disperse it. It's very high in nutrients, very high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you don't want to lose that off the site, but it's just too much in one spot. You can do this with a shovel. In this case, I just used a small tractor with a front end loader, and I just pushed my way across it, then hooked my blade over the pile and dragged it back over. So I mixed the ash with the unburned, unscorched, unheated mineral soil underneath. That's all you have to do. And I went back and forth, and I kind of bounced the bucket a little bit so that I would create a kind of an uneven surface. So there you can see the ash layer in that case. It was about 3 inches deep. I want to get down to unscorched mineral soil. The organic debris is very tough to grow in anything in as well. So it's up to you whether you want to disperse that or put it on your burn pile. And this is what it looked like when I was done with it. So I tried to create a rough surface. Really, like I said, 15 minutes to pile the woody debris, about 15 minutes with my tractor to get the pile done like this, and now I'm done with it. I can either leave it the way it is. Now I chose to try some different seed mixtures on here because this is a great seed bed. And if I can get some preferred grasses on there, then I have to worry less about thistles and noxious weeds invading this, because they're really good at invading disturbed sites. So this is the same site. I put it in quarters. So I tried Dutch white clover, orchard grass, mountain brome, and I just left 1/4 as a control. So this is May, and you can see the native species around there: pine grass and elk sedge, some timothy in the mix around the outside. And this is then end of June. And so what did best in my experience, that you can see the quarter of orchard grass. Orchard grass did a great job on there. The mountain brome didn't do real well, and I'll show you why. Mountain brome is a native. It has really big seeds, which means it's expensive, because to seed in an area, you want to get at least 40 seeds per square foot. Okay, that's the rule. More is better, but at minimum 40 seeds per square foot. So if you have big, heavy seeds and you're buying seed by the pound, the big, heavy seeds are expensive. So there's the mountain brome. That is what the orchard grass looks like. It is about 1/3 the size of the mountain brome. So I got a lot more seed per weight. Plus, orchard grass is a common grass. It's inexpensive. And then the Dutch white clover is really, really small seed. Okay, and I wanted to try Dutch white clover because I wanted to plant something on there that wildlife liked, so it would eat it, and so it wouldn't persist real long. And I wanted to plant something that wouldn't create a fire hazard by getting tall and curing out. And also, here's another culprit. So there were turkeys around, and because mountain brome seeds are really big, I'm willing to bet that these turkeys ate most of my mountain brome seed as well, because when all was said and done, so here's a slightly different pile, I almost got 0 germination off the mountain brome. Just big seeds, a lot of predation on it. It didn't germinate real well. So on the right far corner is the orchard grass. On the left side is the Dutch white clover. The Dutch white clover actually did really well. It's not real obvious and real conspicuous. And this is then end of August, what it looks like. The orchard grass got pretty tall. Again, there's some that blew into this site, which is in the foreground. The Dutch white clover grew and then cured out with the drought, but it didn't die. It just goes senescent. Here's another site, same experiment. So in this case, the mountain brome is on the right side where there's basically nothing. Right in front, on the left side, is the Dutch white clover, and in the far back is the orchard grass, which again did really well. And then the control is the far right side where there's nothing growing there. And then by the end of the summer, this is what it looked like. So overall, my winner was the orchard grass on this. It just did really well on these sites. And where I did nothing, so I left some piles alone, this is what I got. And this picture is actually 2 years afterwards. So recovery left to its own is going to be really, really slow on these burn piles. And so I really recommend doing something with them. Now, of course, how you treat your woody debris, there's always these questions of, isn't this organic matter good for the soil or vegetation? But recall, if you're landscaping, you put wood chips down to suppress weeds and other plant growth. Wood has no nutrients in it. It's just cellulose and lignin, which is carbon and oxygen. And it breaks down, it's slightly acidic. So vegetation recovery on just organic debris beds is very slow. And this debris is very, very slow to release any kind of nutrients that are in there versus creating lots of small piles and burning them. You're actually getting a much quicker nutrient cycling. You're not suppressing your natives that won't grow back. Wherever they're covered with this woody debris, you're going to kill them. So you get a much quicker recovery if you clean up some of this. You get a really good nutrient cycling if you create lots of small burn piles and you burn them on site. And, you know, so, but you gotta do what meets your needs the best. So, you gotta see what time it is, but yeah, we got some good time for questions now. It's 7:11, so I will kick myself out of this.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
It's Dave Brink. I was keeping track of some of the questions that were coming in the chat, and I pulled them into a separate text. I can go back and read those off to you if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be very helpful, because if I need to, I can then go back to the slideshow. Let's see. So, Dave, is that coming up on your screen again?
Yes.
Okay, so if you'd be so kind, and folks, this will work best if you text in questions, and Dave, who is the county agent in Mineral County, will be so kind as to read the questions to me, and I'll answer them. Okay. So go ahead, Dave.
So the first one from Wes Johns came in: scientifically, why is there more smoke emitted from a lower oxygen wet pile versus a hot burning, dry, and oxygen-rich fire? Okay. Does the smoke do the smoke particles stick to the evaporating water molecules?
Well, there is that, but when the fire is oxygen limited, you're getting incomplete combustion. So oxidation is not occurring. And so rather than wood breaking down to its basic elemental components in the fire, it's going to break down incompletely into organic molecules. And those organic molecules are formaldehyde and a whole variety of other byproducts that in some cases are not good to breathe. So it's incomplete combustion or incomplete oxidation simply because it isn't breaking down in the oxidation process completely. But yeah, when you have a lot of moisture in there, of course, remember, water is only going to get 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So it stays cool, and that means that the heat is driving the water off, but it's also distilling the wood. It's a dry distillation process, and so the water is also mixing with a lot of those incompletely combusted organic chemicals.
Okay. And then later on, he asked also, in reference to your VW-sized pile, he asked, how long do you figure you'll need to be present to manage that size pile?
Well, it depends on the weather. If it's raining out or if it's cold, like today, you know, we got some snow, everything's wet, the temperature's dropping, I'll light it, and I can walk away from it because I know it's not going to go anywhere. Of course, the flip side is I will periodically go and check on it because I want to throw it together as it's burning. I don't like to have a ring of woody debris left over because, you know, partially charcoaled wood actually breaks down very slowly. It will persist a lot longer than just a normal piece of wood. So you don't have to stand there and watch it. But now, if a front comes across or the weather isn't where I want it to be, and there is a risk of my fine fuels drying out or the fire is starting to smolder out in the grass, then I will not leave that unattended. I'll stay on it until I get a good charcoal ring on it. But usually as evening progresses, as the temperature drops, the humidity goes up, your risk of it escaping really goes way down, and it's perfectly good to leave it alone. But you still have to monitor the weather. If you feel the wind kicking up, you better get out there and check your piles.
Okay, next question from Jim Watson. Once the outside burns and creates a black donut, it is pretty safe given no wind, So generally only a few hours, but they should be monitored until burned down to embers. I usually hang pretty close for the first hour or two, and then do a checkup hourly or so. I guess that was more a comment. Sorry about that.
Right. Again, the weather is everything. For this, flip to this real quick till we get to these this situation here again that we're talking about. All right, so this is obviously a small pile, but you know, actually, is something like this, yeah, you're not going to have the big flames out of there, but you still have fire there. So now if it's getting dry and the wind is kicking up, all of a sudden there's still enough heat in there that these edges can burn outwards and the duff can start burning around them. So I don't feel good about leaving a fire. I mean, in this case, I'll leave it at this point. I'll check on it, and once it's to this, I won't leave it like this. Once I have it like that, now I'm fine leaving it, because now I have this charcoal burn zone around where the fire is, and it's not really going to go anywhere from here anymore. But it's really situationally dependent. I mean, if it's getting warmer and drier, then you don't want to leave your fire unattended. If it's getting cooler and wetter, then you're perfectly fine leaving it alone.
Okay. Jim Jacobson asked, any tips on curing, burning a very large pile of stumps?
Give them time. Yeah, stumps are really unique. The wood construction is a little different. Wood physiology is a little different. Stumps are designed to hold. They are actually like a cactus almost. They are water reservoirs for the tree. So that root wad, if you pull them out. And I honestly, they burn best after you leave them stacked for a couple of years, 2-3 years. And then they'll burn pretty well. And the problem is that root wads will also have a lot of soil in with them, so it makes it difficult to burn.
Okay. Looks like Jan Smith asked, is there a good method to burn chip piles?
No.
So someone that comes through with like a wood chipper or something and spreads it out there in a nice big pile.
Well, you know, you bring up a real interesting point, because we have some trials and experiments going on. Actually, some that I started back in 1998 with chip piles. Chip piles are unrated burn. And I actually, rather than spreading chips out, I prefer to create small piles, or piles that are maybe 2-3 feet tall and 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. And the reason for that is one of those things in forests that is a natural process is trees die and big logs are on the ground, and those logs are utilized as habitat for a lot of things. I mean, it's not a good nutrition source, but it's habitat, and they're water reservoirs. They get wet and they bleed water all summer long. And so we did these chip trial experiments, and we found within 2-3 years, all the surrounding trees had their roots into those chip piles. The chip piles stay wet. Even in August, they'll still be wet. And again, if you spread them out, they'll dry. But if you keep a pile together, it'll stay wet. And the value in that is then decay fungi can work on them. And so the chip piles we've created, now within 10 years, you won't even notice them anymore. They completely collapse on themselves. They decay. Not much will grow on them because they are so nitrogen deficient that very little can grow on them, but they're not at all a fire hazard. And they are actually microhabitat for fungi, mycorrhizae. We have salamanders. We have a lot of organisms that need those old punky logs as refugia to live in. So I actually prefer, and from the trials we've done, I worked with a lot of landowners. One way of dealing with woody debris is, if you're chipping, is to create strategically placed piles that then become essentially the same thing as an old rotten punky log as far as habitat. But burning them is very difficult. If you're going to chip, then don't. I mean, if you can burn, don't chip them. If you're going to chip, then don't burn them. It's going to be really difficult. It's going to be analogous to trying to burn wet toilet paper.
Okay. Paul Drake had a question and looking back through the chat, looks like he had an extensive aspen grove that had a bunch of down trees into it. And he asks, any thoughts on burning within or outside of that aspen grove to clean it up?
Well, aspen, the above ground portion of aspen is very sensitive to fire. So if you create piles or you burn the aspen stand, you will kill the tree stems above the ground. The flip side of that is aspen is a highly fire adapted species. So if you want to promote regeneration in that aspen stand, then by all means burn it, because, and I mean, I can show you many slides and case studies. When an aspen grove burns, what comes, the roots will all sucker, and you'll get 3 times the density of aspen, and often the aspen grove will expand by 10 to 20% because those roots that go outside the aspen grove will also start suckering. So it's kind of a catch-22 answer to that. If you want to promote regeneration of aspen, then small piles, not big piles, because if you heat the soil too much, you may run the risk of killing those aspen roots. But small piles, you may scorch or kill the trees surrounding that pile because they're extremely sensitive to heat, but you will stimulate a lot of suckering of younger aspen. Okay.
Larry up in West Glacier is asking for a future program on planting seedlings. So that's something to put in your back pocket.
Well,
and then oops.
No, I was just gonna say, if you go on our website this spring, I actually wrote a pictorial article. It's multiple pages on how to plant seedlings. So on the end of this presentation, if you just Google MSU Extension Forestry, and make sure it's Montana Forestry that pops up, not Mississippi or Michigan, but MSU Extension Forestry, you'll go to our webpage, look under publications, and there's a brand new, I think it's a 6-page pamphlet on how to plant tree seedlings by hand, basically, but how do you plant seedlings?
Excellent. Okay, then we have, I think we kind of already discussed this one, the opinion on burning piles versus chipping, masticating wood debris.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of masticating. It works, but you got to be really careful. That organic layer, that A horizon in the soil, so where the organic debris interfaces with the mineral soil, is full of tree and plant roots. If you rototill that, you're going to do a lot of damage to existing plants and trees. Now, if that's what you want to do, then that's the way to go. So if you're going to masticate wood, make sure you don't get your masticating head down into the soil and rototill the soil with it. And again, it throws debris all over the place, and you end up with a fine matrix of woody debris. Individual pieces of wood don't retain moisture well, so their decomposition tends to be pretty slow. Whereas piles tend to decompose a little faster. But, you know, on wet sites, grand fir and cedar sites, mastication, that stuff breaks down pretty quick. On dry sites, the masticated wood can persist for a long time.
Okay, and really quickly, Terry asks, what strategy do you use to determine where to place chip piles?
Well, that's a good question. It's where I don't want the vegetation to grow. I try to not put it right up against another tree stem, but I try to put them in the drip line of trees or in the middle of a clump of trees. So that chip pile will not support vegetation on the chip pile. It'll enhance vegetation around it. So I put it strategically where I don't mind a bare spot being, but close enough to where the trees I want to give an advantage to will be able to utilize that chip pile.
Okay, and Mike H asks, what's a good example or two of decent propane torch apparatus?
Oh gosh,
apparati.
You know, like I said, I just I had one for 30 years that my dog just chewed through the cord. So I just bought a new one at Harbor Freight for $29, and I haven't used it yet, but I like the simple ones. There's really complex ones that have igniters and all stuff. For me, the more igniters usually don't last real well, and when you're burning piles, they get banged around. So I go with the simplest one. And the simplest one has both a turn knob to adjust flow and a lever. So the lever, basically you squeeze it to increase the gas flow, kind of like a flamethrower. The little turn knob increases the gas flow just by turning it. So I like them both because if piles are lighting easy, I'll just use the lever, depress the lever, get the pile going and move to the next pile. If piles aren't burning well, I'll stick the end of the torch into the pile. I'll turn the knob till I get the flames I want out of it, and I'll walk away and let it and do something else until that pile is burning adequately. It's real simple. It's real robust. There's not a lot that can go wrong with it. And for me, it works really well. But like I said, I bought one at Harbor Freight. You can go online and Google propane torches. You'll get a whole lot of stuff on there. But, you know, it's usually the one that screws into a 5-gallon propane tank and just simply has a lever and a knob on it. They're easy to light with a lighter. Just light them on the end. A little bit of gas, not too much. Otherwise, you'll just blow the flame out. But that's the best advice I can give.
Okay, looks like we have a question from earlier. Where'd it go? From Colleen Byrne. What is your elevation, and will orchard grass grow above 3,000 feet and -3 temps? I'm guessing probably -3C.
Yes. So my own property is at about 4,200 feet, but the key with orchard grass is in the winter it needs a snow cover. It'll freeze out if it doesn't have a snow cover on it. So that's usually what I hear with regard to forested settings, but it'll grow almost to any elevation. And where you have any kind of a snowpack, it'll survive the winter. If you're getting into drier sites, then you might look at you know, some of the fescues or even wheatgrasses. I personally don't like wheatgrass very much because it cures out in midsummer and becomes a fire hazard. Orchard grass will, if it has water, will stay green all summer long, and so is less of a fire hazard even. But when in doubt, talk to your local conservation district. They often have seed mixes and things like that, or your county agent. Dave knows, who's asking the questions, also knows enough about grasses to give you some good advice for the local area.
Well, thanks, Peter. That looks like that's all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. A lot of kudos and thanks for the presentations, and you know, learned a lot. Looking forward to the next one, and we'll be checking out the website. So,
all right. Well, thank you all for attending, and I hope you found it interesting. And if you want to see it again, as Christina said, we'll have it posted on our extension website as a YouTube video. And with that, have a great evening and happy pile burning. It's great weather to be burning piles right now.
all right, that looks like it.
All right. Thank you so much, Dave, for stepping in and fielding questions.
Hey, you're welcome. That was a great presentation. Good job.
All right. Well, everybody have a great evening. Thanks for attending.